Solar Eclipse. Moss McLeod was expecting a visit from his daughter. That all the residents of Starlite Terrace knew. But she doesn't exist, Pete told me, when he ran into me on the steps of our apartment complex. It was the last weekend in December, and at this hour of the morning it was still dark. Pete was on his way to Noah's, and I had been looking up and down Dickens Street for any sign of a woman who had, supposedly, just left the building. From time to time, McLeod invents this daughter, Pete muttered, as he stepped onto the dew-drenched grass and stomped towards the pink, weather-beaten Starlight Terrace sign. It was only recently that I had met Moss, who occupied the small apartment next to the laundry room, a stage actor who had gone on to work for a Broadway casting agency. Moss had left New York years ago and moved to Los Angeles. We knew each other only by sight when one morning he approached me out of the blue at Noah's and told me he had run into Jack Palance the day before at Borders, and Jack had remembered him. In the old days, when they were both performing in Darkness at Noon, the play based on Kessler's novel, Palance had tormented him, grilling him without mercy. But yesterday, at the bookstore, Palance had been remarkably friendly, a changed man, Moss asserted, pulling an old black-and-white photo out of his wallet. It showed Jack Palance bending menacingly over a pale young man who had tripped on the stage and was gazing dramatically into the camera. How long ago was that? I must have asked Moss, because, as I recall, he paused only a moment to think, then replied, "I can tell you exactly. That photo was taken on the evening of November 22nd, 1963. We debated whether we should go on at all. That was the day Kennedy was killed." On this particular morning, Moss had rung my bell early, perhaps because he saw light in my apartment. He stared at me in helpless confusion, as if he had just awakened from a terrible dream. His daughter had knocked on his door, he said, and since the light switch by his bed did not work, he had fumbled around and failed to get to the door in time. No doubt she thought her daddy was still asleep, and now she's already on the way back to her car, Moss speculated. He asked whether I would mind taking a quick look outside. His legs were giving him trouble these days. "He invents this daughter to make himself feel better," Pete commented as he shoved the small one-bedroom apartment for rent plaque that was sliding out of its holder back into the middle of the Starlight Terrace sign. Rex's old apartment was still vacant. "Do you ever see Moss at Noah's?" I asked. "He never gets there as early as I do, and if he does, he sits off in a corner, pretending to be engrossed in his manuscript. He goes to Noah's only because he's homesick for New York. He never talked to Rex and me. But you, he seems to trust. By the way, I told him you were also a writer. I was hoping he'd tell you what he's working on. That I'd be interested to hear." Pete grinned and headed off to Noah's, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. His breath formed a white cloud in the darkness as he passed through the glow of a streetlight. I went back into the complex and was just passing the pool in the inner courtyard when the automatic timer switched off the underwater illumination and the turquoise blue disappeared. On the far side of the pool, back where Moss's apartment was, I could see light. His door was still open. "So he's waiting for me," I thought. "He thinks I'm coming back with his daughter." I headed for his door, calling out to him, but there was no answer. As I stepped inside, I saw, on the sagging couch to the right of the door, a cardboard container of melted chocolate ice cream and a bag of Christmas cookies. The television was on, and the screen showed the profile of some retired CIA agent talking on Fox News about Islamic terrorism. I found myself remembering Pete's comment that Moss's principal form of nourishment was Dreyer's chocolate ice cream. Inside the apartment, a musty smell wafted towards me, and it was clear that no one had done any cleaning in years. The floor and every available surface were covered with yellowing manuscripts, legal documents, letters, and magazines. The piles of paper, tipping or toppled over, left Moss little room to move around. I called his name again. Meanwhile, a line in a handwritten letter poking out from a stack of magazines caught my eye. In blue ink, the line read, "For God's sake, don't give up on me, Moss." An insect of some kind was crawling up the side of the paper. "I'm over here," I heard Moss say. He was kneeling at the entrance to the kitchenette by the counter. "Were you able to catch up with her?" "No, there was no one outside the building when I got there. Only Pete on his way to Noah's." "You're sure?" "What am I going to do now?" On the dark floor of the small kitchen, I could make out hundreds of pages of manuscript, scattered in all directions. Moss picked up one of them, then replaced it carefully. "Good God! I must have bumped into the table when I was running to open the door for Amy. Knocked over the whole manuscript. My manuscript. How will I ever get these pages in order again?" It was his life story, Moss explained. He had written it down for Amy, to let her know, as he was determined she should one day, that her father had sacrificed everything for her. Everything. That would put an end once and for all to the lies her mother had told about him, lies with which she had turned Amy against her father and poisoned their relationship. Pete's got it wrong, I thought. This daughter does exist, though it was unlikely she had knocked on Moss's door just now. "Do you have a picture of her?" "Of Amy?" He braced himself against the wall and struggled to his feet, holding onto the door jamb. "I know," Moss said. "Pete claims I just imagine her. It may be true that a few times I dreamed I heard the doorbell and Amy was standing outside. That's possible, but there are signs and portents for everything, buddy." Moss looked at me as though he were testing me, watching to see his words' effect. "So," he hesitated, "can I trust you?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "You won't rat me out when they come." As he gazed at me, I saw he was trembling. Pete had mentioned that Moss was terrified of being taken to a nursing home. His stepsister, who lived in Gainesville, Florida, and supported Moss financially, might insist on his being moved to a home out of concern for his health. "You mean the people who come to take you to a nursing home?" "Don't worry, Moss." Moss went to the door and closed it. "Who knows how they'll identify themselves?" he said. "Off to the home, they may say. Those guys will even pack a suitcase for you, and then it's off to the showers. I tell you, those are coming back. These days you don't even have to read between the lines. Pete's clued in too, by the way. I had no choice but to tell him. But if things reach that point, just follow them in. Don't be shy. They'll search the place, but I'll happen not to be here. Tell them you expect me back in a couple of hours. Got it?" I still had no idea what he was talking about. All I had done was ask whether he had a picture of his daughter. Then Moss went to the closet in the wall opposite the kitchen counter. He beckoned to me. Moss opened the closet, which was crammed with suits, ties, and shirts, shoved them aside, and stepped in. He kneeled, his back to me. For a moment it looked as though he were meditating or praying. And then he raised one arm and groped for something on the back wall. I saw the panel yield, swinging away. Moss beckoned to me again, stepped through the opening, and disappeared. "Follow me." I stepped gingerly after him. On the other side of the wall it was dark. "Wait," I heard Moss saying. "I'll turn on the light." Suddenly I saw, only 3 or 4 steps in front of me, the entrance to a dimly lit bedroom. "This is where you sleep?" "Sometimes," Moss replied. "Well, more and more often these days. It's safer here, in my ark of bulrushes." On the floor of the small room lay a mattress with sheets, a couple of blankets and pillows. A lamp stood next to the mattress. In one corner I saw a radio, a stuffed backpack, a 3-gallon bottle of Arrowhead water, some cans of peaches, and a partially eaten chocolate bar. "Don't rat me out," he repeated. "Don't worry, Moss. But is there any ventilation in here? In the summer it must be like an oven." Moss patted the wall behind the backpack. "There's a vent here. In a pinch I can even crawl through. The freshest air comes in from the laundry room. I used to hear singing, too. He made the night a little brighter wherever he would go, the old lamplighter of long, long ago." "Rex used to sing that," Moss said. "He provided entertainment while he was folding his laundry." Moss hummed as he picked up the lamp. He held it to a framed picture hanging above the mattress at eye level. "Is that Amy?" Moss answered. "How old is she there?" 3. That was on her 3rd birthday," he said. "November 12th. See how happy she is? We were in New York then, in '66. She's offering me a picture she'd just drawn for me." Moss squatted down and pointed to a colored photocopy he had tacked to the wall at the head of the mattress. "I keep the original in my backpack," he said. "A horse?" "A horse with blue wings, if you please. She'd seen it on television. Pegasus. It was meant to protect me," Moss explained proudly. I turned and pointed to a photo of a child on the opposite wall, next to the passage to the closet. "Is that her as well?" Moss held the lamp close to the picture. No, that's a photo from a newspaper article. That's me, the kid with the bandaged head. But the puppy wasn't mine, I'm sorry to say. I don't know whose dachshund that was. Someone just placed it next to me when they were taking pictures for the paper. I'm 3 there, like Amy. These 2 pictures are looking at each other, see? I tried to decipher the yellowed text next to the photo. It came from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The headline was still legible. "Miracle Boy Survives Fall from 4th Floor." So, what happened? They say I fell out of the window, but that's ridiculous. I went back later to see for myself. There was no way I could have climbed onto the windowsill at 3. No, I think my mother threw me out of the window, in a rage. She'd been fighting with my stepfather. A reliable source told me. I don't know my real father. You laugh. He was a milkman, yes, and Jewish too. Marriage was out of the question. To avoid a scandal, they sent her to Vienna, so I was born there, though the official record says otherwise. All her life she suffered from depression, from migraines, from uncontrollable rages. I'm telling you, she threw me out of that window. I landed on the sidewalk head first, dead. Dead is what the ambulance driver said when he got there. He didn't even want to put me on the stretcher, the good man, but the other paramedic insisted on loading me in the ambulance and taking me to the hospital. God only knows why. I must have looked awful. I never found out his name, the man I owe my life to. At any rate, as you see there, I was back on my feet in 3 weeks, and they sent me home with that bandage. Look, Moss pointed to his forehead, above his shaggy right eyebrow. A thin line, a bit paler than the rest of his skin, ran on an angle to the base of his nose and angled up sharply. Go ahead, feel it, Moss urged me. When I put my finger on the scar, the skin gave way alarmingly. There's no bone under there, Moss explained, laughing. That was my brain you just tickled. The fact that doctors left it unprotected like that saved my life a number of times, or so I would say today. There were periods when I was in such despair over my situation that I wanted to volunteer for whatever war we happened to be fighting. Korea, even Cuba, Vietnam. But each time they turned me down. 4F. Moss pressed a finger into his forehead. Nothing doing. A little later, I made my way back to my apartment, saddened and shaken by what I'd just seen and heard. Here, feel how heavy this is, he had said when we returned to his living room and he'd picked up a random pile of manuscript and pressed it into my hands. It certainly is, I'd replied. Take it with you, he urged me. I can't read it anymore. My eyes are giving out. Not right now, I'd said, and was relieved when he took the manuscript back. Hoping to distract myself from the image of the lonely old man living amid that chaos of papers, tormented by anxiety and filled with unjustified anticipation, I climbed back into bed and switched on the television. Outside, the sky was turning gray. Key Largo had already started. A hurricane was approaching the southern coast of Florida. Karl Freund's cinematography captured the chalky gray light, presaging a storm, while Bogart helped Lauren Bacall tie up the boat at the pier. At the hotel, Edward G. Robinson was holed up with his gangsters. Robinson was Johnny Rocco, who had left his Cuban exile and had chugged to the Keys in his boat to close a deal. The gangster was homesick for America. But at this point, Bogart has no idea what kind of a person he's dealing with. He just met Bacall, and from the bow he tosses the rope across the water to her. Bacall, on the pier, catches the rope and places the loop over one of the bollards. And then Bogart uses the same rope to pull himself over the gap, along with the boat and me, back to Bacall. What a feat to glide along, pulling and being pulled at the same time, the 3 or 4 yards over the water, back to the landing, where Bacall is waiting. Bogart climbs into her frame, up to the dock, and then the two of them stand there together in a 2-shot. Now the storm can come. During the commercial, I dozed off. Moments before, I had been thinking about my parents and the way they met on Heidelberg's Main Street, near the corner by the grain market, around the same time as Bacall and Bogart were filming the scene on the dock in the Warner Brothers studio. Had my father and his friend left the Red Ox only a few seconds later? Had they paid their check only 2 or 3 seconds later? Or, alternatively, buttoned their codes faster? A storm was gathering outside, and reached the grain market corner 2 or 3 seconds earlier. I would not have been there to join Bacall on the pier. I dozed off. It seems to me in my dream that I have just woken up. I try to switch on my bedside lamp, but it won't go on. The room stays dark. Everything is silent, and suddenly it becomes clear to me that something is wrong with the fuse. No power in the whole apartment. In my dream, it comes to me that Moss mentioned his light switch was broken too. I make my way towards the closed curtains, sensing that the reason everything is so quiet outside is that it may have snowed. As I stand by the curtain and am about to lift one corner and peep outside, the woman standing behind me on the right seems very familiar. She woke up with me, I realize. A pleasant feeling to have her so close. I move a bit to one side to let her see out. A very faint, high tone can be heard, hovering in the air, like the sound, remembered from childhood visits to the theater when the curtain rises. And in fact, it looks to us at first as if the street outside is buried in snow. All this must have happened while we were sleeping, we think. Then in my dream I realize that what I'm seeing is a raging torrent, not snow, but chalky white rainwater rushing by. Yet it isn't raining. No, it rained earlier. The rain cascaded down from the hills, is flooding at a terrific speed along the street, past our building, and then down below, by our building, on our side of the water, someone is trying to cross the street. Not possible, I think. How can he prevail against the crushing power of the water? He looks like Bogart, but then I recognize Moss. His disheveled hair and the scar on his forehead give him away. As I watch, Moss tosses a rope into the rushing stream. It wraps itself around a blue fender floating by in the water. Moss tries to haul it to land, but the current pulls him into the water. Now he's balancing on the piece of sheet metal, being swept along. It all happens so quickly that it's almost comical. For a little while we can still see him, but by the time he gets to the corner of Cedros, our eyes can no longer make him out. A few days later, when the evening rush hour was already in full swing, I ran into Moss at the intersection of Kester and Ventura Boulevard. He was distraught, muttering to himself. I learned that a few hours earlier he had biked to Borders and had left his bike behind the hedge in front of the store. He had gone inside, had listened to music upstairs at one of the listening stations, had had a cup of coffee, and looked at a few books. That was all. Not until he was making his way back through the store did it occur to him that he had left his manuscript. Painstakingly picked up from the floor, put in order, and stowed in 2 file cases in the basket on the front of his bike. When he got outside, it was gone. Not a trace of the bicycle or the manuscript. "Because you didn't actually park your bike there," I said. "Am I right?" I could tell he wished I were. "But that's the only place I went, I swear," Moss replied. "I went straight from home to the bookstore." "So you're sure of that?" "Yes, I'm sure. If I lose the manuscript now, it's all over. If I've lost it, I'm putting an end to this charade." "Who would steal a bike like yours?" I asked him. "Only a kid, and he'll abandon it sooner rather than later." "You think so?" "It's quite likely." For a good hour we searched all the streets around Borders, from Willis Avenue to Camarillo and back to Hortense Street by way of Natick. Then Cedros, Vesper, and Vista del Monte. Moss pointed out the house where Marilyn Monroe spent her first wedding night. 16 she was at the time. She called her husband Daddy, Moss told me. The first photographer she worked with stole her from him. Along the sidewalk, people had put out Christmas trees for the trash pickup. In my mind's eye, I kept seeing the foolish image of a child's bike lying on the ground. In movies made in the 50s, the father sees a bike as he turns into the driveway of his single-family home. Smiling, he picks it up and parks it neatly by the front door. Did such things ever happen in real life? Certainly they no longer did. Shortly before sunset, Moss and I were walking down the long alley behind the Ventura Boulevard shops. We should have looked here first, we agreed. Whoever had stolen the bike would have turned first onto this nameless street, to be out of sight, then would have ditched the manuscript and tossed the file cases somewhere, into one of the garbage cans or bins behind the shops. Moss was still in utter despair. The accumulated memories of the past 20 years, the whole story he wanted to place in Amy's hands someday, to justify himself once and for all to his child, and now he had been robbed again. "She's the one who stole it, you know," Moss remarked, as he held the rickety crate I had climbed on in order to shine the flashlight we had borrowed from Luce at Noah's into a large trash bin, nothing but garbage and discarded Christmas decorations. "Who do you mean?" I asked. "My wife. She stole Amy from me back in '66, kidnapped her, took off, was gone from one day to the next. I was a casting agent at the time, on Broadway, had been working there for a couple of years already, not a struggling actor anymore. I was making a good living. We had a 5-room apartment across from Central Park, and she had a fantastic job. Stella was an actress, and she was appearing in an Edward Albee play. That's where she must have met him. He was a TV writer, came from L.A., was just visiting New York, but all that I found out only later. One evening I come home, suspecting nothing. No letter, no note. My neighbor says he saw her getting into a cab with a ton of suitcases, her and the child. They were heading for Grand Central, that much he was able to pick up. My lawyer tried to calm me down. He wanted to do some investigating. Days passed. My nerves were shot. Stella had never been any good with the child, you know. Too strict for my taste. In some respect, she reminded me of my mother. I thought Amy might really be in danger. I mean, who's crazy enough to run away like that after 3 years of marriage, without a word, without a warning, and leaving not a single trace, robbing me of the thing that means the most to me in the whole world, this child. She knew that was the way to get to me, to deliver a deadly blow. One evening, 2 weeks had passed, I think, without any word from her, and still not a trace of them. One evening when I was meeting some people in connection with my work, they invited me to come along to a dinner party. I said, no, I'm not up to it, but they insisted. An hour later, I was feeling better. The other guests had all listened to me. Amazing, every one of them. The host and his wife were writers from L.A. They'd rented an apartment in New York while they were doing research, I heard, for a movie, a story about the New York Mafia. Burt Lancaster's name was mentioned, as was Anthony Quinn's. But mostly everyone listened to me, with great interest and lots of sympathy. I bewailed my plight. Can any of you understand? Yes, they could. They showed genuine compassion. When dinner was over, everyone got up. Only one person remained seated, too drunk to move. I thought I was also. I'd had a few. The guy sitting at the corner of the table across from me was around 45, not much bigger than me, but with a powerful build. Up to now, I realized he'd hardly said a word, only listened, to me and the others. Now he looked straight at me. Some of the guests were leaving, others standing by the bar with the host. Now he looked straight at me and said, "Why don't you take out a contract on her?" "A contract?" I asked incredulously. "Sure, happens all the time," he replied. "One day she doesn't come home from work. After that, it won't be long before you have your little darling back." I asked whether he was serious. "I thought you were serious," he answered. "Yes, but," I say, "but that's crazy. And they'd figure out right away who—" "That's what they wouldn't figure out. You haven't figured it out yourself. You don't know anything. Right now, you don't even know where she's gone with your kid." That was true. I had no idea. "It'll cost you $500, he continued. "We need a picture, the name and number on our driver's license. You pay, and that's it as far as you're concerned. The money passes through 50 hands in, let's say, 30 states. No one knows who ordered the hit. And one day you get word that you're to come pick up your daughter. That should put a stop to your whining." "Can you imagine?" Moss continued. I actually considered it. I mean, you can't imagine how humiliated I was. And at the same time, terribly worried about Amy. "Think it over," the man said. He gave me the name of an Italian restaurant in the Bronx, De Bruno on Tremont Avenue. He'd be having lunch there on Friday. "You go in, sit down, order some food, then you go to the restroom. When I come in, you give me the $500 and return to your table. That's it." The man got up and went to say goodbye to the hosts. I didn't even know his name, but I was sure, absolutely sure, that he would get the job done. I could give him the money, and the problem would be solved. The next morning, I'd slept horribly. The whole thing seemed utterly crazy. But towards noon, after I'd checked with my lawyer, who had no new information, nothing on Stella's and Amy's whereabouts, I began toying with the idea again. I wasn't sure how long I could keep going. My nerves were shot. Work was almost out of the question. Imaginary scenarios preoccupied me. "It'll pass through 30 states, 50 hands," the man had said. I could see him before me, his strong hands, which would write my wife's name and driver's license number on the back of her photo, would stick it in an envelope, toss it in the mail, I thought. No phone call. Someone would open the envelope. Where? Somewhere outside. The sun is shining, and this next man who doesn't know he's number 2, or how does this work? Does he know? At any rate, he sets down his coffee cup next to the photo and balances his lighted cigarette on the saucer. Does he look at the photo? Yeah, but just for a second. The next man will take a longer look, I thought. Maybe in Duluth, Minnesota. He has nothing better to do. It's raining there. He knows the mail came from, it's postmarked Ithaca, New York. Ithaca, he thinks. That's where I had a thing with that woman called Betty. And he looks at the photo and thinks she looks a little like her. And the next guy, the fourth, where does he live? With his mother. She brings him the mail, the paper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and a letter from... The rain has blurred everything. The rain in Duluth, Minnesota. No one can make out the postmark, no matter. The guy in St. Louis isn't the one either. Just sends it on to Flagstaff, Arizona, or to Montgomery, Alabama, Monroe, Arkansas, to Pueblo, Colorado, to... Hey, why not? Gainesville, Florida, where a driver in a midnight blue Buick waves at my stepsister over the crosswalk. On the passenger side, the photo is lying under a pack of cigarettes and a heavy bunch of keys. And 3 days later, in Wallace, Idaho, a man is splashing cold water on his face after a night of boozing in Spokane. He gives the photo to a young fella whose girlfriend he plans to make a move on in the next few days. I see the young fellow in a diner somewhere along the highway. It's nighttime. He's exhausted, has just ordered, and is thinking about his girl. He hasn't a clue. He has some time while he waits for his steak with eggs over easy, coffee. The waitress refills his cup. He wipes his mouth with a paper napkin. He pays on the way out. A brown envelope falls out of his pocket as he takes out his wallet. He picks it up, stuffs it in his side pocket, pulls a 20 out of the wallet. As he does so, I can see 5 crisp $100 bills tucked in next to it. Whole chains of images like these kept passing before my eyes, as if to reassure me no one's going to make the connection with you. Completely impossible. No evidence will point to you. The trail, that was the tantalizingly reassuring part of these imaginings. The trail got lost in a thicket of details, in these cliches of gangsters, details with which I would have no contact ever. I couldn't conceive of what that really meant. Pass through 50 hands in 30 states. How did that work? I had no idea. But you could conjure up an endless network, one that extends so far that you lose track. I lose track of the fact that it started with you. I wouldn't know anything, I told myself. The whole process would take on a life of its own. The next day, it was the day before the appointed one, I scraped together the money. Normally, I would have had that much on hand, or at least 200 or 300, but she'd taken the money too. A couple of actors owed me $50 or $60. I withdrew another 100 from the bank, borrowed 50 more from various people, and so on. At least I was careful not to give myself away, even when I was toying with the idea of going through with it. Careful. I thought, what's to prevent me from checking out the restaurant a day early, having a meal where I was to meet him tomorrow? Can I do that? Could I do that? How would it feel? How does it feel when you go there, do the deed, and leave? And once more, I was already on my way. The whole business seemed completely insane. It wasn't just the plan that was insane. It was the very thought. You're not going through with this, Moss McCloud. You won't do it because, and here my fear crystallized, because they'll catch you. Very simple. Still, if someone would guarantee that, no one can do that. No one can do that because no one can guarantee anything, and because no one knows about it. No one knows when, where. Who would want to give me a guarantee? Well, for that very reason, I told myself, it could actually work. Suddenly I was standing in front of the restaurant. The smells wafting onto the street were very good, and I was famished. I went inside, sat down at a free table, and ordered. Looked at the other diners. Classic types. If one of them had objected to my staring, I could have placated him. In those days I always had complimentary tickets on me. And who would be offended if you told him you were thinking of casting him in a Broadway play? I was enjoying my food and was almost finished when it occurred to me that this was a last meal of sorts, or at least could be, if I took the plunge the next day and came back with the money. A last meal, a last something final. I got up and went to the men's room. I'd almost forgotten that part. I was alone in the men's room, stood there, washed my hands, pictured myself. I reached into my pocket, handing him the money, quickly, painlessly. No envelope, nothing to get in the way of his counting it then and there, if he wanted to. No one would see. He'd go into the stall, and in the meantime I'd wash my hands, dry them thoroughly, back to the dining room. I paid the check and made my way home by a roundabout route, thinking, all right, how did that feel? Answer, not that bad, really. Besides, I had all kinds of things to attend to, appointments. I had no time for complicated thoughts, and wouldn't have the next day either. It was a normal day, and tomorrow would be a normal day too. On the weekend, now, that might be different. That was when it would hit home. Okay, but you could arrange to be with people. There was no shortage of actors and actresses dying to meet me. Invitations arrived daily. Most of them I turned down. But what if there were problems, if my nerves got the best of me tomorrow after lunch? Well, I could let down my guard, accept a couple of invitations, I thought, just to help me over the hump, and also to let myself be seen. I could take Harold along to a few events, my lawyer. Why not? A boring guy, and later, but that's something I didn't find out right away. He really made colossal mistakes. Harold always wanted to meet people, especially women. A boring guy, but in that respect insatiable. I'd get through the next few weeks somehow. Then I was certain after some time had passed it would be as though nothing had happened. And not until the call came. The call. That I couldn't avoid. I had to be ready. The night before the rendezvous I didn't sleep a wink, or at least that was how it felt. The next morning I was a wreck. Had a dim memory of an awful dream, something sinister. I'd gone down to a cellar with a mafioso. I knew it was a cellar in his house, and he pulls on a string, turning on a naked bulb. And then he bends backward in this harsh light, hollowing out his back, supporting himself on some crates which slip back a little, making a terrible grating sound. Yes, he bends backward, positioning his throat under the light, offering it to me. And in my dream, I know that I have to cut my finger. Cutting your finger is part of the ritual here. I have to hold my bleeding finger over him, over this guy, who will open his mouth, and my blood has to drip into it. And as he receives my blood and swallows it, I know I have been made, am one of them. Awful dream. I went to work determined to forget the whole business. No sooner had I arrived at the office than my secretary told me that the producer I was scheduled to see at 2:00 had canceled, and we should try to move something else into that time slot. But then I hear myself saying, "No, don't bother. I'm going out for lunch. I'll be back around 3." The rendezvous was to take place at 1:00, and just before 12:30 I set out. I had to hurry, took a cab. We made good time at first, but then, of course, we hit traffic. I paid and got out, started to run. I knew it wasn't far, just around the next corner. I pass a bank and see my reflection in the plate glass window, rushing towards my destination, my hand in my pants pockets, Sinatra style. And I realized completely insane. The large pane provided just enough of a reflection. The light was right for me to catch a glimpse of myself. And I stopped dead, looked at myself in that sea of glass, saw my eyes, the eyes of a stranger staring back at me. I was so unrecognizable that it horrified me. I turned away, just a half turn, to the door, took one step, then another, went into the bank, made my way to the teller, and deposited the money, the whole 500, into my account, took the stamped deposit slip and stuck it in my wallet, just to remind myself of how close I'd come, to remind God and myself, to remind him of how close he had let me come, but also myself that at this moment I was sacrificing any certainty of seeing my daughter again. The stamped slip represented proof, if you like, of my pact with him. I was making this sacrifice because, well, in the last analysis of my own free will. I had seen something. Crazy, that reflection. Put there to let him see the truth. He was the crazy one. I think he saw himself in me at this moment, saw himself in my plans, and was prepared to empty out his vessel of anger. That's what I had recognized. I hurried out of the bank and knew in my heart, now you're free of that. That and the rest too. And I can tell you, the pain I felt at the thought that I might never see Amy again is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. I kept walking, passing the spot that had decided everything. The sun was at a different angle now, or maybe a cloud was blocking it. At any rate, nothing caught my attention this time. I'd glanced at the bank window because I wanted to see again what I'd recognized. But, as I said, the window was no longer reflecting. The light had changed. It can't have been that I no longer had the money. So I passed the spot, then forced myself around the next corner, instead of turning back and catching the first cab, you understand. Walked to the corner and made the turn. The restaurant where we were supposed to meet was only a block away. I headed in that direction. Should I really do this? I wondered. What if he recognizes me as I walk past, runs after me? Ridiculous. Complete nonsense. Nonetheless, I stopped. And then I saw, no more than 20 or 30 yards away, a small crowd gathering. And on the other side of the street, a photographer. He'd taken pictures for me once, but I hadn't heard from him in a long time. He runs across the street, and I go up to him. What's happening down there? He said he'd received a phone call. Come with me, let's go and see. And we're allowed through. The police haven't arrived yet, but we can hear sirens approaching. Now I'm standing at the entrance to the restaurant, at the very spot where I stood the previous day, before I went in and looked for a table. The diner's motionless, still in shock. I see blood on the floor, a pool that's growing, see two men lying there. One of them I recognize immediately. Yes, the one I was supposed to meet. He must have been some kind of bodyguard. And the other one, I don't recall his name. A man had come in, fired 3 or 4 shots, then left the restaurant. And by the table over there, they'd been sitting at the same table as the victims, stood my hosts from 2 days ago. The woman, hysterical, her dress spattered with blood. Not her blood, no, not hers. The people whose dinner party I'd attended. They'd been having lunch with one of these men, a mafioso they'd met in the course of doing research for their screenplay. The whole thing had gone down not 5 minutes earlier. My knees still tremble when I remind myself of that. This mob hit, as it was later described in the papers, had taken place no more than 5 minutes ago. If the light striking the bank's window, if that cloud in the sky had passed over the sun, just imagine, what a crazy thought. If the wind driving the cloud had been a bit stronger and the sun had been hidden a moment sooner, I wouldn't have stopped, wouldn't have seen anything in the window, or at least not enough to stop me in my tracks. I'd have gone around the corner and entered the restaurant just as it was happening. And that's what you described in your manuscript for Amy? I asked Moss. Yes, the plain truth, Moss replied. I didn't want Amy to think I was trying to make myself look good. I had these thoughts. I had this opportunity. I struggled with the decision, and I made it. She has to know that. She has to know how far a person, how far I, her father, almost went. Can you understand that? Later, I asked myself, what would have happened if I'd given the man, if I'd borrowed the money right away from the people who dragged me to that party, then everything would have been taken care of that evening. Such things happen. Another man might not have hesitated, and he would have had a chance, a good chance, not to lose what I lost. You can't imagine. This whole business had enormous consequences. 2 or 3 days after the rendezvous, or after that bloodbath, I heard from Harold, my lawyer. He'd found them, Amy and my wife, and the man with whom she'd run away to L.A. So I learned who it was. He had a house in Brentwood. Top-notch lawyers, a good name in the industry, which at the time didn't make me jealous. I had a good name myself. But in the end, what did a man's name mean if you took away another man's wife, and his child too? Why not? To keep her happy. He had plenty of money and 2 children from a previous marriage. A hard worker, but not a workaholic, people said. Known for being punctual and reliable when it came to getting a job done. Always knew what was hip, what was in. I think he was involved in the Monkees series, which was playing on TV at the time. Well-liked and in the right circles, and Emmy a couple of Golden Globes on his mantelpiece. A beach house in Malibu. Occasional drug use, not the hard stuff, and nothing that can be proved, so not usable in a custody challenge, Harold told me. For the time being, I focused on other matters. I'd done the right thing, I thought. I'd prevented a murder, or that was how it could be seen. I had the locks to our apartment on Central Park changed, moved out, taking a room in a small hotel, and sent Stella the new keys. Here, these are for you. The whole apartment belongs to you and the child, I wrote. But please, come back. Do it for Amy. Come back to New York. Nothing. No reply, no reaction at all. She didn't take me up on it. And as I said, she had better lawyers. As became clear to me, I should have changed mine, but Harold stalled me. Finally, he convinced me that it would look better in court if I had an apartment in Los Angeles, for the child's sake. You can't ask a child to get on a plane every weekend. Her lawyers, it's true, told me from the beginning, you're never going to see Amy again. Let it go. Spare yourself the aggravation. The aggravation? Yes. Everything was going downhill. I don't even remember why or what the specifics were. My agency wasn't getting the right contracts anymore. It was my fault, no doubt about it. Nothing interested me. God knows. I was preoccupied with other things. Suddenly the money was gone and I had to sell the apartment on Central Park. I'd bought it for $5,000. Now I got $125,000 for it. Who knows what it would be worth today? 2 or 3 million at least. And I lost everything, risked everything, and lost it all. Over the years, I must have spent more than $100,000 on lawyers. I moved to L.A., first to Beverly Hills, then to Studio City, and for the last 15 years, I've been here in Sherman Oaks. At first, it looked as though things would turn out all right for me. The court recognized the trouble I'd gone to, saw that I'd sold everything and followed the wife who'd abandoned me and taken the child. Also, I could see my daughter now and then. 3 days a week. That was the deal, the judge's ruling. By now, Amy was 7. And it went fine for a year. Then my wife, my ex-wife, came out with this terrible accusation. Someone must have suggested it to her. Just do that and he'll be forced to clear himself. In the end, they'll rule in your favor. Some suspicion always sticks. She accused me of molesting Amy. Took me to court with that lie. That's when I lost her. Never saw her again. It's true that one time I did ask Amy to rub my back. So what? It was hurting and it made me feel better when she massaged it a bit. So what? I ask you, so what? One time I kissed her good night. Good God, I always kissed her good night. I loved her, always loved her. That child was everything to me. She was in bed and the blanket had slid off her leg and I kissed her on the thigh, then pulled the blanket over her. That's all. One time. Completely innocuous. But her mother must have made a point of grilling her every time she came back from a visit. Amy, does Daddy kiss you? Okay, where does he kiss you? So she took Amy from me. The court ruled in her favor, and I'd lost once and for all. And it hurts so much when I consider that Amy might... it's imperative that she know there was no abuse, that I always loved her, that her mother tried to turn her against me with all kinds of lies, that I risked everything and would do so again. You know what? I'd do it again. At least I think so. I'd spend all the money and try to get her back. What else could I do? What choice would I have? On the other hand, my wife can praise her lucky stars that after-dinner conversation in New York, that it didn't take place after she accused me of abuse. She really lucked out. We all lucked out, I think. And you never ran into her? Your wife, just by chance? No, I never ran into her again. She had a successful career. It's the ultimate irony and tells you more about Hollywood than about her. As a TV writer. And the woman couldn't write. She couldn't even write a check. And won an Emmy. I assume he wrote the script and put her name on the title page, maybe for tax reasons, what do I know? And bam, that's how it goes, another Emmy on the mantelpiece. She can't put two sentences together, that woman. No. Thank God I never ran into her again. By the way, after the first time we saw each other, the same thing happened. I thought it just wasn't meant to be, wasn't meant to lead to anything. The whole story was completely crazy. As I said, there are always signs and portents. But that I already knew at the time. That was, it was in 1962. It must have been August, shortly after Marilyn died. In 1962, I was still an actor. That's what I was until just before Amy was born. Then I gave it up. Things went quite well for me. A casting agent offered me a job in his agency, taught me the ropes. All right, so at the time, I was still an actor. I went for an audition. I still remember the play. It was that Wilder play, Our Town. George and, what was the name of the female lead? George and Emily. That was it. We were both auditioning, Stella and I. We didn't know each other yet, but the two of us were assigned a scene. Sit down in the corner there and we'll call you in. We had 10 minutes to rehearse together, to go over the lines. Our Town. I haven't the faintest idea why they would still be putting on that play in the 60s. Oh, well, it was the early 60s. At any rate, we sat down and read through the scene, the one in the drugstore. We come in, sit down, I order something for us, and she waits for me to declare my love. That's how I think it went. I'm not so sure anymore. At any rate, there we were, huddled in our corner. She was very friendly. I'd left my glasses at home and was having a hard time making out the text. She read it to me without getting impatient and kept saying, "Look at me. Forget the text. The others will forget it too if we really wow them, if they can feel what's between us." And the minute we got through the scene, we started again, and there was something happening between us. No doubt about it. She looked into my eyes, and there was something there. I've no idea what she saw. My God, Stella, what did you see back then? What madness life is. Stella looked at me. I spoke to her, said what George says, that I won't leave our town, won't look for a job anywhere else, because why should I? I found everything I was looking for. Here, you. And more I don't want. All I want is you. And at that, I'm telling you, she gives me a kiss. It was... Man, this is crazy that I'm remembering it now under these circumstances. But I don't think I ever experienced anything like that again. It wasn't in the script, that kiss Emily gave George. And it wasn't a fleeting kiss, not at all. She moved her face a little, tilted it towards me, and suddenly she was very close, intentionally, provocatively close. And then she gave me that kiss. And the kiss was, how should I put it, filled with infinite gratitude for what I just said. The lines George has to speak. Now that I found you, I never want to leave. Her answer came in the form of that kiss. Her gratitude was erotic, Gratitude for having been really understood. As if up to then finding understanding had been only a hope. Gratitude that she'd arrived, finally, that her life had become real. Both of us, we were swept off our feet. Our ears were burning when they called us in for our audition. I've no idea what they thought of us. We were probably speaking much too softly from the beginning, paying no attention to technique, still completely under the spell of what we'd accomplished outside. And what had we accomplished? What did it mean? Damn, what wouldn't I give to know? What in the world was it? The directors interrupted us several times. Louder, please, then sent us on our way. It was clear we didn't have a shot, but I couldn't get that woman out of my mind. I was besotted with her, as you can imagine, so bowled over by what had happened in that moment that when I walked her to the bus, I didn't even ask for her phone number. I didn't know her name. Or did I? Did I know it already? Doesn't matter. At any rate, I didn't have a phone number or an address. The number of the bus, yes, but it was long gone. And that was it. That would have been it. No, that's how it should have been. And I still remember that moment, that instant, even if I'd never seen Stella again. And then, 1 or 2 months passed. It was October. I just turned 33. We all thought our final hour had struck, literally. It was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during that 1 week in October '62. The crisis was building from day to day. Kennedy had found out that the Russians had installed launch pads for mid-range missiles in Cuba. They can reach every city, every larger city in North and South America from there, we heard. A nuclear war. And about 20 Russian ships and submarines were on their way to deliver more rockets. That was the situation. And Kennedy says, stop, and takes the whole thing to the American people. A major address on television, speeches on the radio. We see what's going on, or, as always, think we see what's going on. He orders a blockade of Cuba. Nothing can get through, not a ship, not a plane, we're told. And in the meantime, the Russian ships are streaming towards us. Towards the blockade. The confrontation is inevitable. Tomorrow, we say, or sometime tonight. Then all hell will break loose, because no one can back down. High noon off the shores of Cuba. And we've known this for days. We've lived it. And we sense that it can turn out well. Khrushchev, those Reds, they'll stop at nothing. Reds, that says it all. They're going to go ahead and press the button. Everyone is sure of that. All over. Just when things were looking up. Better days, freedom just around the corner. all over. The end of the world. Bombs will be dropped, the first on New York. Everyone's glued to the television, to the radio, hoping and praying that maybe, just maybe. But most people can feel it in their bones. This time, we've had it. We won't get out of this alive. And some of us go to the Plaza that evening, the fanciest hotel in New York. I'm there with a woman I know and a few close friends. We decide to get totally smashed in the Oak Room, dark and elegant and far too expensive for us. But what does that matter? No one will live past this night. We're convinced of that, completely convinced. So we're sitting in the Plaza, our whole group at one table, and the other tables are full too. People have accepted the situation. They're with their best friends, ordering glass after glass and listening to the radio. Everywhere in the Oak Room, radios have been set up. No television, radios. So we listen, talk about the impending nuclear war. Any minute may be our last. And on the radio, they keep reporting how far the Russian boats are from the blockade line. So you can calculate when the first boats will get there. Another 425 miles, 354 miles, 290, only 175. Unbelievably nerve-wracking. And we're downing one martini after another. I don't recall how long this went on because at some point I stood up. I wasn't properly drunk yet. I'd had a bite to eat beforehand. Maybe it was the excitement, the adrenaline. Anyway, I got up and headed for the men's room and passed a table, one of the tables on the other side of the room, and there she sat, Stella, with a couple of men, a couple of girl friends, and she saw me too, saw me immediately. She was all dressed up. Something black and white. Don't ask me. It rustled softly when she turned her neck. Yes, she came towards me. And I saw clearly, what was it? What was it in that moment? We spoke to each other we didn't have to say the words. We read them in each other's eyes. So we meet again, but we won't have the chance. That's what I read in her eyes. Won't have the gift of living together. It's now or never. These minutes may be all we have. Listen, Amy. Moss was speaking directly to me. If anyone tells you this story, maybe it will be my friend here who went looking for my manuscript with me. The manuscript I wrote for you. Moss stared at me, his eyes never wavering from my face. But we didn't find it, Amy. Not a trace. This friend of mine will tell you the story when I'm dead and gone. He'll tell you what happened that night when I took her by the hand, your mother. We went upstairs where I'd asked for a room. We didn't say a word. We just clung to each other's hands, not a word. And that night, Amy, I'm telling you, when no one thought we had a chance in hell, when we'd all given up, I saw her and she saw me. And I loved that woman, Amy. I loved her. He'll describe it for you, how all that matters is that moment when we drew you into life and you were with us, conceived that night. We were all there together. By now it was completely dark. Moss and I were standing in the unlit alley behind the shops on Ventura Boulevard. We had long since given up the search. But Moss had dragged me along, drawing me deeper into his story with every word, holding me captive. He had spoken to me as if every word were testimony. And now I could see it as he finished speaking. They were standing before him, the woman and his daughter. He had them back. At this moment, in this moment of conception, Moss had gathered in all he had lost and found it complete. He had collected his life around him and said, "You're both here. Nothing is missing. And nothing was missing, and Moss glowed in the light of his visitation.